Let's see if that. All right, did that fix it? Great. So strange. I don't understand why this class does it. I couldn't find any settings different between this class and my other class. That class, the camera likes to act up. This class, the mic likes to act up. I guess it can't always be perfect. Sorry about that. Definitely let me know if it looks like I'm talking and nothing's coming through on your end. Definitely let me know as soon as you can so that I can fix the audio, because it seems to be the common problem for this class. I'll check it again though to see if I can figure something out. Maybe I need to close all the way out of Microsoft Teams in between my classes rather than staying in Teams. I wonder if that would solve the problem. Just reset Teams essentially. I'll try that next Thursday, see if that fixes it, and check the settings. All right, so we're recording. Everyone can hear me. My screen is up. So let's first talk about question papers. And this is actually the earlier classes Canvas, but it looks the same as yours. Obviously, this is my view of the Canvas, but you should have this question paper resources area. And this is the most important thing for learning about the question papers. So as for the due date for the first question paper, it is a midterm paper, so it's right when our second exam is open. That same day, the midterm question paper is due. So that is when your first one is due. Then you will have a final one at the end of class. So April 30th is when that one will be due. So let's talk about how to do a question paper. You can find all the instructions and all the information you need in the block in Canvas called Question Paper Resources. So here I have essentially the rubric and template. It looks like that's not open, so I'll open that now. And then this is actually a link to a video where I describe it. I will actually email that to everybody after class as well, just for students who aren't here. It actually looks like all but one student are here, so that's good. But I'll still email it out so it's a good reference. But you can find essentially everything I'm going to talk about right now in that video. Then here I have an example question paper that I wrote. So it essentially shows you what I'm expecting you to turn in when you turn in your question paper. Then these documents here are basically to help you write in APA format, how to reference, how to paraphrase research, those kinds of things. So these are all like writing help tools. And then this and this are probably the most relevant. And so I've opened those. So let's look at these question paper instructions. So this essentially tells you exactly how to write a question paper. I'm not going to read it word for word because I'll be describing it right now. But this would be a good thing for you to read the entirety of to make sure that you understand what's expected of you. Essentially, the end product, what you're turning in, will be a 2-page double-spaced paper on a topic of interest to you. So something that we touch on in class might inspire you. We talked at length recently about epigenetics. So if there's something else in epigenetics, if there was a specific aspect of that that was really interesting to you and you wanted to dive into research, you could do research on that. If you are interested in, last time we were covering the birth process and parental factors and risk factors. If one of those topics really interested you, you could write your question paper on something there. It should be a topic that we didn't cover so exhaustively that your question is already answered. It should be a new question built off of what we've learned. So anything we've touched on in the chapters, anything we've touched on in class, if a student makes a comment that you think, oh, that is really interesting, I want to go look that up, that would be a good thing for a question paper. So I actually have an example question paper on Ritalin. And so my basis for that question was when I was a child diagnosed with ADHD, that was one of the options, the medical options was Ritalin. And so my mom didn't put me on Ritalin because she had heard things about, like, it'll make it more likely that I would get addicted to methamphetamines later on in life. And so she was worried about the long-term effects of me getting addicted to methamphetamines. So it was one of the big reasons why she didn't put me on it. So that inspired my question. I touched on in the chapter on Ritalin. So And so I was like, oh, I want to learn more about Ritalin. And so that's what inspired my question on Ritalin. You might go through a similar process. Maybe we touch on infertility or something like that. And you're like, oh, I or my parents or my friend had problems with infertility. I want to learn a little more about this specific aspect of it. Maybe you want to learn more about epigenetics. Maybe you want to learn more about cognitive development in middle childhood. So essentially anything that we touch on in between now and when it's due is fair game to start off your question for a question paper. So I really want it to be something that you are interested in. If it's something that you're interested in and we don't really touch on it at all in between now and that class, send me an email, be like, hey, I really want to do a question paper on this, and I'll let you know if it's good, because I do want it to be kind of psychology focused rather than like exclusively like medicine or biology focused. If something history focused wouldn't really make sense. So as long as it fits the assignment requirements, I'll probably say yes. But hopefully it's something that we touch on that's of a lot of interest to you. That's the main thing about this assignment, is that I like students to do and learn things that they're really interested in. All right, so you've got your question. My question here in this example is Ritalin. What are the long-term side effects of Ritalin? Does it lead to addiction later on in the future? So that's my question. Hopefully you have some ideas of maybe a question you might ask. So what I will turn in the end is going to be a 2-page double-spaced paper that is either Times New Roman or Liberation Serif font size 12. So that's kind of standard APA sizing, is size 12. They actually recently changed it. You can use smaller sizes with some text formats. But just for us, we're going to do Times New Roman or Liberation Serif at font size 12, double-spaced, 2 pages of content. So that's about 600 words for the actual content portion. So 2 pages of written report on research, and then a 3rd reference page. So if you go on to, if you've got like 3.5 pages, or let's say you have 2.5 pages of written content. So 2 full pages and 1/2 page of written content answering your question, and then a 4th page, that's your reference page, that's great. If you have, say, 1.5 pages of written content and then a 3rd reference page, you're probably going to lose a few points because it doesn't meet that 2-page requirement. So again, this is about 600 words, which isn't that long. So, but also it depends on if there's a lot of I's in there. It might be a few more than 600 words. So the 2 pages is what you should stick to. Then down here, I have an example of how to do some references. So in APA format, this is how to do a reference for a journal article. You have the authors, you have the year, the title of the article, title of the journal, volume number, and then this is an example of one of my articles and the APA citation for it. So you can kind of copy that from your information. You can see in your research the research articles you're reading, you can pull out the author's name and write this all entirely. I'll show you with our research search how you can do this just with a copy and paste with some of the tools we have. One thing that you will probably have to do is a website reference. So 2 of your articles do need to be peer-reviewed research articles, and then your 3rd source can be any other really good high-quality source. So it might be something from maybe it's a researcher who, as well as writing papers on their topics, they write a blog as well. We'll actually look at a couple of those from Darcia Narvaez later on in the class, who does a lot of research on moral development in early and middle childhood, and a lot of parenting tips. So she actually does research, she publishes a paper, but then as well as that paper, she has a blog where she puts the research. And so it's well cited, it's a good source. But would any other random blog that you find, would that be a good source? Probably not. So a random blog from some random person is probably not a great source, but something from like the APA website, that's probably a pretty good source. So you've got to look at the author, look at the place that's publishing it, and make sure that it's a good relevant source of someone who knows what they're talking about, basically. And if your outside source doesn't line up with your peer-reviewed sources, you can probably suspect that maybe they don't actually have the right information. Some people who report on research don't necessarily know how to read research, which is a skill that I'm getting you to start building right now. Maybe you've done this before and you've already got some of those skills. That would be great. So let's say they read a news reporter or a magazine author or writer is writing an article on a research study. Let's say it's a correlational study. A lot of times you'll find that they report the results as causal, that one thing causes this thing when they're reading a correlational study. And that's just because they don't understand what that correlation doesn't mean causation. So if you're reading that report, you might be reporting the research incorrectly because the original author did. That's why going to a lot of peer-reviewed research articles is a really good skill. And we'll see how to do that right now, basically. So I'll show you the example question paper I have here just to give you an idea of your final product. So I've got my name, I've got the class, and I've got the question up here, and the general topic. It might be childhood development is your general topic, and then your specific question is cognitive development's effect on socio-emotional learning in 4-year-olds. It doesn't have to be that specific. That was a really specific question. So here I've got my paper. I've got my 2 pages of content that came from research. So here you can see in-text citations, and after we find the research, I'll show you how to do those. And so it's essentially 2 whole pages, and then I have a page of references. So again, you need 3 references. 2 of those need to be peer-reviewed journal articles. So this one's a peer-reviewed journal article, it looks like. This one might not be. So, and then this one is actually an error. It's not actually a full APA citation. So that's an example of something I might look for and be like, oh, you're missing part of your citation there, and possibly lose some points depending. All right, so let's go find some research specifically on Ritalin that we would use to write our paper. The best place to go for this is actually our library. So go to the main library page, and you can either click here on research or down here, research databases. So let's click on research databases. And here there's a bunch of these links to different companies, sometimes specific journals, but generally these are different organizations that kind of collect research articles on specific topics. So the main 2 that'll be relevant for us are PsycInfo and Google Scholar. So PsycInfo is this one down here. I clicked P and then PsycInfo. It contains almost all psychology journals and all psychology articles from 1887 to now. So it's a really good source in a psych class to search for good research in psychology. There's similar kinds of journal search things for medical research or biology specific or history or those kinds of things. So this is a really good one for us. So we'll click on that link. I should be logged in now, but if you're not logged in, you'll have to log in through your Salt Lake Community College account. And then it basically, you pay library fees with your tuition as well. And so that some of those library fees go to paying for this kind of search that you can search through here. Actually, if you just go to EBSCOhost through PsycInfo, you can do any search, but you might not have access to as many full text articles. Essentially, your library fees pay for access to those full text articles. Should science be behind a paywall? I don't think so, but this is the world that we live in right now. So those fees are all pooled and collected, so all students throughout the college have access to these. Even after you're out of college, I've found that a lot of community libraries also pay for not as many as school libraries tend to, but a lot of community libraries, so like the Salt Lake County Library does pay for some journal subscriptions. For example, the library the LA library when I was in California, it paid for quite a few journal subscriptions as well. So there's that option too. Let's look here. Let's see, we want to find things about Ritalin. We want to find if it leads to addiction. So let's say Ritalin, hopefully I spelled that right. Addiction. So those are 2 search terms that I want to look into. And again, this is searching psychology journals from 1887 to current. So it's saying, hey, you've got too many, essentially too many results here. Let's narrow it down. I'm going to try to make it not narrow it down and give me a lot. Sometimes it doesn't do it. It might just bring, oh, good, it did it. Sometimes it'll just bring you right back to that page, and you do have to narrow it down by clicking some of those boxes. Let's open that up in another window. And so then you can say, okay, well, the main thing I'm interested is actually probably not Munchausen syndrome, but that would be interesting. I bet you would find no research on that. So on Ritalin and addiction and Munchausen syndrome. Feel free to look up Munchausen syndrome. It's kind of a sad one. Yeah. Anyway, so these are my articles. We've got limiters here that were automatic to full text. So it's only searching things that PsycInfo and your library fees have access to with full text articles. So you can read the entire article, not just the abstract. Even if you search for this on your own, say, and you didn't log in, you should be able to read every single abstract of any article it searches for, but you might not have access to as many full text articles. So another thing that you want to do is make sure that you're limiting your result to academic journals, and specifically ones that are peer reviewed. I believe I was trying to figure this out in my earlier class because they changed some of the interface. So I wasn't actually able to find the clicking button to say I only want peer reviewed journals. So I think it might just be completely default set to peer reviewed right now. Yeah, so if you do see the option, it might just be because right now all it's showing me are all peer reviewed. So maybe if some things are coming up as not peer reviewed, you might get that option. I'm not sure. So make sure it's peer reviewed. Another way to check is it should say the journal. So here is the title of this article, and here are the authors of this article, and then here is the journal, European Journal of Neuroscience. You can go to their main webpage, just Google European Journal of Neuroscience, and they should say somewhere on their main page that we're a peer-reviewed journal or something like that, and we focus on these topics. So what you would want to do is first look at some of these titles and see if one of them would help answer your question. So again, I'm looking for Ritalin. Does it lead to addiction? Maybe some other side effects of Ritalin. So here we've got Ritalin-induced gene regulation in the adolescent striatum. And that doesn't sound like it would help me at all in this case, but it does sound kind of interesting. So maybe I'd save that for later, where I probably wouldn't read it because of time. But let's see, so reviews can be really useful. They can give you a lot of information. They're not actually a study in and of themselves. It's basically someone else's question paper on speed, ecstasy, and Ritalin, the science of amphetamines. So you might find a lot of information for this specific question in that paper. It's not actually a study itself, but it could be really good. So let's open it up and we'll look at the abstract in a minute. Non-medical use, we're only looking for medical use, so this one that's looking at recreational use is probably not really relevant. I used different search terms than I did with my earlier class, because the earlier class, it took a while to find some good research to answer our question. And I was hoping with the different search terms it would be a little quicker, but it's going a little slower than it usually takes. But this might be it might take you a while, depending on your question, depending on how specific it is, depending on your search terms. It might take you even up to an hour to find articles. If you've spent an hour and you haven't found 2 good articles to answer your questions, that is probably too long. Actually, I would say at your level, if you haven't found anything in, say, 20 minutes, email me, tell me your idea, be like, hey, I'm having trouble finding research, because I don't want you to spend hours and hours searching, but I do want you to get the experience of searching. So in the future, if you want to come back and find a good peer-reviewed article in medicine, in psychology, you have some of those skills. This might actually be a useful one, talking about just its general effects. But this one actually sounds like it might be perfect. So Ritalin, basically, for ADHD and drug relapse and criminal offenders. So this is probably going to have, it's also a randomized placebo control trial. So that's an experiment too. So this one might be really good. So we've got two that we think might be good. The next thing to do is look at their abstract. So for any that you see the title and you're like, oh, that sounds like it might be really good, the first thing to do would be read the abstract. So read it entirely. So here's the abstract. So let's say we read that and we're like, oh yeah, this sounds great. I'm not actually going to read that right now. We're just going to pretend, yep, this one sounds great. We're going to use it. If it wasn't great, just click out of it and pick a new one. So I picked that one. I'm going to use this for my paper. Then I can read this abstract. Oh, that's nice. They have a correction in this. So based on that, you might look at the correction and look at this and see, hey, does this look like it will actually be relevant to my paper? Well, they're doing an experiment, basically, a randomized control trial. Some people get placebo, some people get Ritalin, essentially, who have ADHD. So it's probably going to be really relevant. So let's say we read the whole abstract. Sounds great. The next thing to do is you can cite these papers. I mentioned I would give you a quick way to cite things. On this page, you can click this little cite button, and it can give you the APA citation. So just make sure you scroll down to the APA version, because it's already formatted the correct way. So you just copy this, paste it straight into your reference list, and that is one of your APA citations. You can do the same with this one. Cite this, APA, I want this one, and paste it right into your citations. Make sure it has that hanging indent. Make sure it's matching the Times New Roman font 12. And now that we've read the abstract and it looks like these will answer our questions, we can either click PDF full text, which I generally recommend. If you have the option, click PDF, but I'll show you HTML as well. So go to the full text article. So this is essentially, now you see this is actually a book review. So this wouldn't actually fit. If I had actually read the abstract, I would probably have told that. So let's ignore this one. This one doesn't actually work, but it could be your third article. It's not a peer-reviewed research article, but you could still use that as a reference, but you would still need 2 peer-reviewed research articles. So I tried to open the HTML, and I guess this is it, actually. Yep, this is the HTML. So that's what it looks like in HTML version. I'll show you what it looks like for this study in PDF version. Maybe. Might not want to open in a new window. All right, so this is essentially, if you, I'm so sorry, I just punched my microphone down. That was, so this is essentially, if you had this printed journal in front of you, this is what it would look like. You've got the title here, the journal is Addiction Research Report. Here's the title of the article. Here are the authors of the article, where they went to school at, like where they are right now. The DOI, that would be relevant if you were trying to take this information and make your own citation, versus, again, you can do that copy and paste thing. So here, this is the abstract. It should all be the same as what you've already read. So looking over the abstract is definitely important because it's essentially a summary of the entire article. And for your level, the next thing I would do is actually read the entire, or skim the entire, probably read though, the introduction, because the introduction will give you a lot of background research on Ritalin, on ADHD. See here, globally, the number of amphetamine-type stimulant users far exceeds the number of opiate and cocaine users combined. So that might be an interesting or relevant fact for you to use in your paper. You might need that information. So it gives you a lot of background in the introduction, and then the materials and methods. Hopefully it's still recording, so, and we didn't miss much. Yeah, it looks like my network is having problems. All right, so for your purposes, reading the abstract, reading the introduction, those are great. Ignore the methods and the results. The methods essentially says this is how we set up our experiment. This specific methods you could probably understand reading it, but some of them you probably won't at your level. So it's fine just to ignore it. Results is essentially saying this is what we found mostly in statistical language. I'm not getting any responses. So I wonder if I'm still disconnected. Shows. Okay. Maybe it was just being slow. So good. Everyone can hear. So again, ignore methods and results. Results, see it's got this big table of stats. It doesn't matter to you. Relevant if you're actually doing research in the area, but for your purposes, ignore the methods and results and find the discussion. So it'll generally say discussion. It might say conclusion. Sometimes the general discussion will also have like a conclusion as the last couple paragraphs too. So read the abstract, intro, and discussion. Those are the main things you want to read because the discussion will then report their results in kind of normal language. Again, this is written for a scientific audience, so other scientists, but it's written more in plain words versus numbers and statistics. So it's saying this is what the statistics mean. This is what our final conclusions are. This is how it's relevant to the field at large. So reading the abstract for the summary, the intro for a lot of background on the topics might answer your question right there. And then the discussion is like their results in more plain words. So those are the things to focus on. You've got your information. You can start writing your paper. But that's PsycInfo. I did want to show Google Scholar too. Let's go to Google Scholar and do a search. We'll do the same kind of search. Go to Lynn, and we'll do long-term use or something like that. So here, again, you should be able to get a drop-down menu. They changed their settings, so it's not in the same place. It used to be just right over here, a box to click to say only peer review. So again, either find that box or double check the journal. So here we've got the authors. The journal here is Pediatric Drugs, but you can see here there is no link to a full text article. Here, this one has a full text, this one has full text. So I would generally recommend only looking at those that have a full text. So let's see, maybe method, use and abuse. So this talks about use and abuse. It's from 1999 though, so might not be super relevant depending on the question you're asking. If we've touched on, say, Freud, and you're like, oh, that sounds really interesting. I want to look at research or newer research based on Freud or reviews of Freud's work. You might have to find pretty old articles to answer that question. Versus Ritalin, something in the last 15 years, maybe even 7 years, is probably more relevant to your answer. So for this specific topic, I wouldn't pick something from 1999, but depending on the question you're asking, there's no year limit. So depending on the question you're asking, the best material might be from 20 or 30 years ago. So this one's a little bit newer. Long-term psychostimulant medication on growth of children with ADHD. So that one sounds really relevant. So growth. So here is their journal. Again, if you had the printed copy, this is what the page would look like. The title, the authors, where they're from. This actually shows you that it was peer-reviewed because it says they received it on this date. They received a revision, so they sent it out to peer reviewers. The original authors made revisions, and it was that revision was received then. They sent it back out to peer reviewers, and the final version was accepted in 2004. Man, that is a lot quicker than my turnarounds when I submit papers. I'm usually told, hey, wait about 3 months for the review to come back to you, and then I'm on my own time. I can finish it in a day or a week or a month, and then another 3 months for the next round. So this is a little quicker than I usually get, but I just wish it was a faster process, is I guess what I'm saying. So again, abstract, read that whole thing, read the intro. If it doesn't say, basically after the abstract, the intro starts. So this is the intro. It's going to have a lot of information about stimulants, about ADHD. So this is probably a good place to get in answer to your question, again, skip the methods, skip the results, jump down to discussion. There's a lot of stats in this one. So here's your discussion. So again, they're talking about the results in light of the, of the previous research. I just accidentally clicked on one of their in-text citations. And that's what in-text citations are for. Essentially, they are saying this is relevant to these same findings that are found in these articles. So what is this Swanson article? Well, I can go down to the references and I can look up that specific Swanson article. That's why you do these references. This is why they do these references. So we can track the evolution of ideas, where this idea came from, what it's tied into. So let's go and look at our example question paper again. So now I found my 2 peer-reviewed sources. I found a good other source, maybe a book, maybe that book review, maybe a web page on Ritalin. So now I start writing my paper. I use those sources. I paraphrase some of their findings. For example, all of my citations here are actually paraphrases. So let's see. Ritalin influences neurotransmitters in the brain, including dopamine and norepinephrine. So I got that fact. I learned that from this Gottlieb article from 2001. So I didn't just come up with that myself. I didn't do the original research to learn that. I learned it from reading this paper. So I cite that paper. Now, this is not a direct quote. A direct quote would have quotation marks, or you should include quotation marks. So if Gottlieb actually wrote, Ritalin influences neurotransmitters in the brain, including dopamine and norepinephrine, I would put direct quotes around that right here, quotation marks, and right here. And I would also put P dot whatever page it was found on. So Gottlieb 2001 P dot 13, or I found it on page 13. So that's how to do a direct quote versus these are all paraphrases. So I learned maybe in there they reported in their own paragraph, maybe it was a long paragraph, about how Ritalin is influencing dopamine, a paragraph how it's influencing norepinephrine. I don't need all that information. I can just say, well, I learned Ritalin influences dopamine and norepinephrine are the main neurotransmitters. So I put that there and say, hey, this is where I got this fact from. So that's the importance of the in-text citation, and this is how to write that in-text citation. And then if someone is reading this and wants to go back to that original research, they go, okay, Gottlieb is this is their author, this is the paper, oh no, where's the journal? So it makes it so that person then has to go and search for that. So it's better than not having any references, but having something like this where you have all the information. Pleasure and discipline in the uses of Ritalin from the International Journal of Drug Policy. Having the full citation in your reference list is the best. So most of your research paper will be just you reporting on the research you've learned and found. You can have your own input into it though as well. So I mentioned at the beginning, my idea for this paper came from being diagnosed with ADHD in childhood, and my mom didn't want me to use Ritalin. So I talk about that here. So in class, I discussed how my mother didn't want me to use this because of these problems. There was a concern that Ritalin was addictive, but luckily, Ritalin does not seem to be addictive or lead to addiction of non-prescription methamphetamines when used in appropriate dose prescribed by a doctor. But it is possible that Ritalin may have stunted my growth. So that's one thing from some of these articles I learned is that Ritalin does have a tendency, it's a risk that it can stunt growth. So I was smaller than average in childhood, so that could be a good reason. My mother's fear of it being addictive turns out not to be a problem, but it might have stunted growth, and I wouldn't be as full grown as I am right now or something like that. So it doesn't have to be only the research report and reporting the research. You can put into this is why it's important to me, this is why it's relevant to me, that kind of thing. It should mostly be the research, but you don't have to stay totally detached from it too. So this is a pretty good example because we've got 2 pages of content, we've got multiple references. So hopefully that gives you a lot better idea on how to do a question paper and what we're looking for, how to do a search for a question paper. Are there any questions on a question paper before we jump into our finishing of chapter 2 and starting chapter 3? With changing gears from question papers to the chapter, why don't we actually take a quick break? If you've got a question, feel free to either raise your hand or type it while we're on this little break. But let's be back here at 10:43. So we'll do a quick break and be back here at 10:43. And don't forget to put any questions you have about question papers in the meantime. All right, and we are back. So let's finish up with chapter 2 and then jump into chapter 3. So it looks like recording is still going. My screen is still sharing. All right, let me know if you cannot hear or see the screen or anything like that. It looks like it should be working normally right now. All right, so I do believe that we did talk about some parental risk factors, and we started talking about prenatal care. Just a quick couple brief things for the developing fetus. Making sure you have good prenatal care is a huge protective factor. So making sure you're getting exercise, proper diet, prenatal vitamins, that's very important for the developing fetus. Getting proper testing at various intervals during the preterm process. For birthing, there's a lot of different options. So actually a really great link to go to is Baby Center. So it will talk in a lot of detail about things like natural childbirth, cesarean delivery, water birth, using acupuncture for pain. All those different options will be discussed in a lot of detail, even more than your book here at babycenter.com. So that would actually be an example of a website that could be really useful for a question paper. So if your question was something on really early childhood development or the prenatal development of an infant, that could be a really good source for your third source for a question paper, as an example. All right, so let's talk about some risks of low birth weight. So there's a couple categories here, and each has a higher and higher risk. So low birth weight is less than 5 pounds 8 ounces. Very low birth weight, which is at higher risk for these problems and more problems, is less than 3 pounds 4 ounces. And then extremely low birth weight is a child being born at less than 2 pounds 3 ounces. So a lot of times preterm infants and low birth weight coincide. So kind of like the earlier it's born, the lower it's going to weigh, because it's really, it's really in those last couple months and even weeks of development in the womb that the baby is putting on a lot of weight, finishing up the development of certain features and organs and things like that. And so it's really putting on those couple pounds in the last couple weeks. So it's very important for its survival and development to have the last bit of that development. So being born preterm or at low birth weight puts you at higher risk for things like infections. It's on the next slide, basically. About 10% of babies are born preterm in the USA versus about 4 to 5% in other developed countries. So we're not doing as good in that department. So looking at maybe the prenatal care of other countries that are doing better might be a good idea. So most preterm babies, like I said, are also tend to be low birth weight. So what are some consequences? So lower survival rates, higher correlation to learning disabilities, like being on the autism spectrum or ADHD, death as well, breathing problems later in life. So all of these are at higher risk the lower weight and the earlier on in the child is born. So what are some treatments for a child that's born at low birth weight or born preterm or both? There's a couple. NICUs you've probably heard of before. Kangaroo care. This is actually an example of kangaroo care. This would either be a volunteer, the parent, or a nurse basically holding the baby close to them, strapping them very close to their body while they're getting similar kinds of NICU care of oxygen and things to help simulate kind of that womb environment. And then massage therapy can help as well, especially for limbs of the growing little child. So there's a lot of different options and things that are being researched a lot. So for the parents in the postpartum period, for parents in the postpartum period, there's a lot of P's in those words there. The lack of sleep is a primary complaint. So honestly, that's my primary complaint even now when we're 4 years past the initial postpartum period for my youngest. With that, sleep loss is correlated with increased stress, impaired decision making. Generally, your immune system isn't working as well, also, and depressive symptoms, which can be especially important, especially if you're having postpartum blues or even postpartum depression symptoms. So, with that, for the person who gave birth, there tends to be, and also this can happen with a partner who didn't give birth too, but more so, especially with this one, there's a lot of hormone changes that are happening in the first couple weeks after giving birth. So you are developing these specific hormones to help a fetus grow appropriately, develop organs, things like that. After giving birth, your body is essentially going back to kind of its new natural state. And so there's a lot of different hormones changing. It might lead to more or less anger, more or less happiness, more or less depressive symptoms, more or less anxiety than you had before giving birth. So there can be and it can change even day by day because those hormones are readjusting that quickly. So with this, 70% of people who give birth experience postpartum blues. So these are symptoms of anxiety and depression that don't last for too long. So it's really common to have these for a couple weeks, so maybe 2, 3, possibly 4, but generally as the hormones get right back into their new balance, these kinds of symptoms should subside. If they don't, about 10% of people who give birth experience postpartum depression. Again, partners can also, but it's at a far lower rate. And so essentially this is a major depressive episode that was triggered by the giving of birth, and the hormone changes, those kinds of things can then trigger this depressive episode. And so this is more common than I think we generally like to talk about just to people. Oftentimes a person is expected to be really happy with a new child, but if you're experiencing a period of depression, one of your symptoms might be that you can't feel happy or excited about it. So usually this is apparent at about 4 weeks after delivery. Like I said, a lot of people do experience postpartum blues, but if those continue up into a month after that birth, then that's a pretty good sign that this person might be experiencing postpartum depression. So at that point, if they're still having difficulty doing daily tasks, difficulty coping, they have other symptoms of depression generally, so like either a negative or a neutral affect, not being interested in doing things. Those are pretty common symptoms of depression. Sleep problems that don't seem just to be caused by an infant's sleep schedule. And these have essentially just extended out through that 4-week mark. You should go and seek treatment from a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So a psychologist is the one who will do more, like you'll have a meeting for a sit down meeting with them for say half an hour to an hour, where they'll do things like cognitive behavioral therapy. So psychologists will generally be doing more therapy versus a psychiatrist. You'll generally have a shorter meeting time with them, maybe 10 to 30 minutes. And what they will be focused on is prescribing medicines, checking what side effects you have, what kind of symptoms you have, those kinds of things. So psychiatrists trained as a medical doctor, so they went to medical school, and then their last couple of years, they were specializing in the medicines around psychiatric problems. Versus a psychologist probably went to, probably didn't go to medical school. Instead, they went to a clinical psychology program probably, or a PsyD program to learn specifically about therapy techniques. So psychologists will generally be doing therapy, though if they do get the specific medical training to do prescriptions, in some states they can. I think Arizona and Colorado they can, and there's a couple more. But I don't believe in Utah psychologists can prescribe. So they would be sending you to a psychiatrist to get a prescription medication. And that's basically what psychiatrists focus on, is prescribing and checking the dosage levels, checking side effects, things like that. So it is important to talk about these topics, especially things like postpartum depression, because 10% of people who give birth experience it. That's 1 in 10. That's quite a lot. But it's something that's not talked about. Similar to infertility, it's not really discussed too much in just general media. So it is nice to see it in general media, like this is a comic book, a Daredevil comic book. Daredevil's mother left him in the care of others, depending on the version, like depends on who she left him with. But she wasn't a part of his life growing up until his adulthood because she had such severe postpartum depression. And so he's saying, hey, as an adult, I totally understand. You had a chemical imbalance. It's not your fault. So you should get treatment now, he's saying, for depression, or could have got treatment then, those kinds of things. So it is nice to see it in media because it helps people understand, hey, there are 1 in 10 people who experience postpartum depression. It's something that we should consider and be able to support people in. All right, so that is the last topic of chapter 2. Let's jump straight into chapter 3. We kind of breeze through physical growth and get to some brain and neurological growth and some cognitive development. So that does tend to be some of my favorite aspects. So physical growth, we tend to grow, especially in infancy, in a cephalocaudal pattern and a proximal distal pattern. So your tests, you don't have to pronounce those for your test, but you do need to read them at least. So cephalocaudal means you're growing from top to bottom. So an infant's head will grow first before the lower extremities. Proximal distal is growing from the center of your body towards the extremities. So the head and the trunk basically grow first, and then the extremities grow after that. Here's a couple images to kind of put it in a different visual way. So we mentioned this in our example of continuous versus discontinuous development. Physical growth in infancy is really very discontinuous. It happens in growth spurts. So generally, an infant growth spurt lasts between like 24 and 48 hours, and there's often a long time between growth spurts. It might be a little more than a month between 2 growth spurts. So with that, 7/10 of an inch is the longest recorded lengthening. So an infant growing 7/10 of an inch taller within that 24 to 48 hour period. So that is a really dramatic growth spurt. And then head circumference, so like how round your head is, growing 3/10 of an inch at that same period of time, are the biggest sizes that we've seen in a single day. So usually they won't be that big. That's like the far end of the spectrum, but that's really amazing. I cannot imagine in, say, adolescence when I would have, say, growing pains or something, if the next day I woke up and I was 7/10 of an inch taller. That's just very dramatic. So with that, average newborn's 18 to 22 inches long, about 7.5 pounds. So you can see that compared to the low birth weights of 5, 3, and 2 point something pounds. With that, infants do lose about 5 to 7% of their body weight in the first couple days. So you'll get weighed at the hospital, take them home. If you weigh them 3 days later, they're going to have lost maybe even a pound, depending on how much they weighed. And that might be really surprising, but this is pretty normal because this infant is now adjusting to, rather than getting their nutrients and vitamins and whatnot pumped straight into them, now they have to feed by sucking, swallowing, digesting. So learning that process can be a little difficult, and so they'll lose a little bit of weight, but then they'll start to grow or put on that weight again. So about 5 to 6 ounces per week, and then they should grow about 3/4 an inch per month in that first year. So again, that 3/4 an inch could be all in one single day, which is pretty impressive, I think. So here we have some growth charts. You've probably seen these in doctor's offices or your own medical records. At 2 years old, we tend to be about 26 to 32 pounds and about 1/5 of our adult weight. We are about 32 to 35 inches and about half of our adult height at age 2. You can actually go and look at a calculator because the prediction is pretty close. If you take your height at age 2, and some calculations will also take your foot size and see like the day, and the days you were born. So how many days have you been born at age 2 to predict pretty accurately the height in adulthood. So based on that, my son is probably going to be 1 inch to 2 inches shorter than me. My daughter, like maybe 3 inches shorter than me, and that's a little taller than their mother. So both my wife's kids will probably be taller than her, which we joke with her about maybe more than we should. So with that, let's move on to brain development in infancy. So this is one that I think is really, really interesting. We saw those pictures of prenatal brain development, how the structures were growing so quickly, so that at 9 months, at birth, pretty much the structures are all in place. You can identify them. There is still up to age 2 stem cells specializing into neurons and migrating to their proper place. So there is a little bit more growth that way in between birth to age 2. But at age 2, you're essentially your brain, the neurons themselves, are in the places they're going to be your entire life. You have essentially the amount of neurons that you're going to have the rest of your life. So with the brain still developing this rapidly, it's really important to protect babies from falls and head injuries. So this is why shaken baby syndrome is such a bad thing, because it can really severely damage these different parts of the brain that are still developing, nearing their completion of development. So don't shake babies. Don't do it even if they're really frustrating and won't sleep or won't stop crying. I know my kids had colic a couple different times in infancy, and it's really, really tough on parents who are already sleep deprived. Put them down, take a break, leave the room, come back later. That's definitely better to leave them there crying and with a bottle or something like that than to shake them, for sure. It would not help. So by the second birthday, the brain is about 75% of the adult weight. So with that, you're at about age 2, you're not going to be producing those stem cells that then become neurons anymore. So that basically stops at about age 2. So it's only 75% of the adult weight at that time. What do you think the other 25% is? So what becomes that rest of that 25% in between infancy and adulthood for the weight of the brain? Or what else is happening that accounts for the rest of that weight? Either type your comments or raise your hand for what you remember from the book or your own ideas. We've got an answer of hormonal changes for the weight of the brain. I mean, hormones definitely affect how the brain is responding and acting. Your hormones are, in large part, not entirely, but in large part, your organs' messages and part of the nervous system that way. So in your, I might mix this up with another one that starts with P, but pineal gland is reading those hormones and then activating different brain structures, understanding that organs are doing certain things because of those hormones. So it can definitely have an impact, but most of the weight isn't going to be coming necessarily from hormone changes, but it's definitely a part of the process. Very good. So other things that might be part of this process of giving our brain essentially more density and more weight in between age 2 and adulthood. All right, well, let's talk about why then. So hormone changes is definitely one thing that impacts the entirety of brain development over time, and some of the other aspects of that entirety of brain development lead to this additional weight. So at age 2, you've got a lot of connections, but also at age 2, you're going to be making lots of new connections, new dendrites, new axon branches. So let's look at a picture of a neuron to answer this question. So here's a neuron. We've got the cell body. Each neuron is an individual cell. So it has a cell body where most of the important things like using energy, taking energy to different places, your mitochondria live in there in these cells. Then you also have a nucleus that has the genetic information of that cell. Also, with the neuron, you have dendrites. Dendrites are the part, well, let's go in order, I guess. So axon is this long thing. So this long I guess you could call it an information highway along wire. You could think of it that way, along network cable. So one single network cable going from this single neuron, this, which you could say this is a computer, and then your network, your Ethernet cable, which then branches off into axon branches. So these branches might each touch, this might touch one neuron, this might touch another one, this might touch another one, and so on and so forth. So the single axon might still be able to have branches that touch many, many other neurons. So as these neurons are living, as these cells are living, it might develop, if you're using it, more of those axon branches to talk to more cells. Also, these dendrites are the message receivers. So you could think of it as an input for the one single computer of this neuron. So with that, so you've got multiple antennas or inputs or input wires to bring messages into this neuron. And then it sends one message out that can branch between multiple neurons. So the development of those dendrites and axon branches makes up most of the weight of our brain by adulthood. So at age 2, what is happening is that your neurons have a certain amount of dendrites, certain amount of axon branches. As you use different parts of your brain, certain dendrites will just be reabsorbed into the cell body. It'll realize, hey, we're not using maybe these 3 dendrite branches, so I'll reabsorb them so I'm using less energy, because the cell needs energy. Each of your neurons needs a proper environment to live and to work properly and quickly. If you have too much alcohol, you can poison the neuron and it'll die. If you have just a little bit of alcohol, it'll work a little slower. We'll talk specifically about how it does that. But the neurons themselves, they're trying to be energy efficient. They are trying to use only the energy it needs, and your brain takes a lot of energy. So it reabsorbs some of these dendrites, and so it reabsorbs and reappropriates that mass. It doesn't need that much mass. It doesn't use it anymore. And so the rest of your body can, right? So the dendrite branches and the dendrites and axon branches is where a lot of the weight comes from. The other thing is the myelin sheath. It's actually different cells that work in combination with the neuron cells, but you can think of it as a fatty insulation on the wire, on this one output wire. So the myelin, it has mass as well. So your brain at age 2 doesn't have too much myelination. Probably about this part of your brain is now myelinated entirely, and the very middle, like the center of your brain, so like inside, is myelinated, but then the rest of it kind of goes in a wave. It starts back here, and then as you get to adulthood, the very last thing is your prefrontal cortex to get myelinated entirely. So it's always kind of happening, but it's mostly in that wave pattern. So at adulthood, you have all the myelin, you have all these new connections, and that's why your brain in adulthood has more weight and has more mass, because you have such more density of dendrites and axon branches at that time, and the finished myelination. That's what makes up that last 25% of weight. And so the process of developing those branches and those axon branches and dendrites, and for myelinating, that's all is very dependent on hormone changes for sure. So that's those together, the hormone changes, the use of your brain, the use of certain skills, specializing your brain to do specific things, leads it to be plastic in a way that your brain's different than it might be if you had been raised in a different kind of environment. All right, so how do we study the brain in infants? Well, we could use PET. That uses X-rays to get basically an X-ray of the brain. MRI requires a patient to be still, so that's not great with infants because they like to move a lot. EEGs actually work pretty well. You might have seen an EEG cap. You might have had an EEG, little electrodes that can see electromagnetical activity in your brain to see what parts of your brain are being active. FNIRS is basically using near infrared light in the same way as the X-ray. So it's less damaging to the neurons. It works pretty well. You can actually use both EEG and FNIRS. when a baby is moving. So put a little cap on them, have it do sense what the brain is doing while the infant is playing with blocks or something. So they're really good ways to look at the nervous system. All right, some other big structures of the nervous system. Your hormone producing organs are all part of your nervous system. So they're all part of it. This is looking just at places where we have neurons. We've got the brain and central nervous system, the spinal cord. We've also got nerves that go through all our arms and all our limbs, even to organs to get other senses of how they're doing. Our eyes, the rods and cones, are specialized sensory neurons. So a rod and cone, you could think of the rods and cones as basically like specialized dendrites that are sending a message into the neuron and then sending that visual information to the brain through an axon. It's essentially is just a specialized neuron. So, yes, this is what I was wanting to get to, is watching a human stem cell specialize into a neuron. So this little video here, and hopefully the audio all works as we watch it. We don't need all of these anymore. So these two videos, this first one is actually a human stem cell specializing into a neuron. So in prenatal development up to age 2, this is essentially what's happening to take a stem cell and make it into a neuron, move it to the place in the body that it's going to live for the rest of your life. So let's watch that. So hopefully everyone's able to hear the quiet music from the video. I'm just testing to make sure the speakers and the microphone, everything's working together well. But up here you see the time code, so it's now 21 minutes into this process. These are, not all of them are stem cells, but many of these are stem cells. And some of them are specializing into neurons. So that's the process we're looking at, and I'll make a couple more comments as we're going through. So here you can see this little stem cell developing things that look kind of like dendrites or axons. So it's slowly morphing in towards a neuron. And again, I think this is still in minutes. This might be hours. I'm not sure. No, this is minutes still. So this is a really good example. The cell dyes don't let you see all of the structures here because the focal length, we're only looking at a very thin slice. Basically, this is a whole network of other cells that the stem cells are kind of using to migrate the newly developing neuron to its final place. So your brain is not just the neurons, there's other cells there that are kind of, you could say it's like a scaffolding that holds the neurons in place. So these stem cells are following along those pathways to get to their final living place where they will live the rest of life, essentially. So hopefully you saw there that big cell, that big stem cell. You can actually see the nucleuses and in the cell bodies of these other cells around there. You could see little bits moving around within the cell, and then really suddenly it's like, all right, we finished enough processes. We're now going to be a neuron. So we've probably got a dendrite or an axon here, dendrites or axon here. It's a little hard to tell with all the other stem cells and neurons around it, but it's pretty much now a neuron. And this is a good example of, this one's done now. We've got, these are probably dendrite branches, and this is probably its axon that will be connecting to other things. These also might be the structural cells around it kind of holding the neuron in place. It's hard for me to tell. But that is what real stem cells and real neurons look like. So as we talk about plasticity, we're not generally talking about the development of new cells, because that process we just watched of a stem cell differentiating into a neuron, that basically stops about the time you're age 2. In the hippocampus, which is what we're looking at in this video, in the hippocampus of rats, there is definitely new stem cells being turned into neurons. In humans, it seems like we're doing that too. But obviously with rats, we can do a little more to do experiments to see that easier than with humans. But it does seem like the same thing is happening in humans. So there's a couple specific areas of our brain where stem cells still do become neurons, but generally, once you get to about age 2, no new neurons. And so we might, you have, let's say you get to 100% of your neurons by age 2, you might add like 0.05%. So another couple hundred neurons or something like that. It's not a really dramatic number that you're specializing later in life. But this happens a lot from this video. This is going to take a look at a neuron growing a new, I think it's a whole new dendrite arm. So growing a whole new dendrite out of its cell body to reach out and connect with other neurons around it. So some of these cells that we see here in this video, some of these are those structural cells around, but we can see a couple neurons right here. And then we'll see it growing a new dendrite. And that happens really dramatically quickly. So we have 4 minutes, or no, this is 4 hours, 20 minutes? I can't remember. I'll have to look at, I think this is hours and I think this is minutes. But let's watch. So it's highlighting with little arrows the dendrite reaching out and connecting with other axon branches and other cell bodies. So let's watch that one more quick time. Look for those arrows that it's highlighting. So this is basically it's sending vesicles of information, not the neuron sending information, other cells sending vesicles of like nutrients and other things. What we're most interested in is these. That dendrite growing and reaching out even further than it was before. This dendrite reaching out further than it was before. So that can happen within hours. So you can build new connections between neurons within just hours. It's really quite amazing. So when we're talking about brain plasticity, usually that is the process that we're referring to. So that growth of those dendrite connections, those axon branches, that's what leads to more weight in your brain later on. That's one reason that we can learn and develop new skills, because we're making new connections in our brain. So that was just a couple cells we're looking at. That can happen all over your brain. As you're learning chess and you come back and you play it 3 days later and you're a little better, you've made some new connections there. As you're learning to read or do other things, you're making connections, and that's how it's happening at the cellular level. What you're doing is having a bigger network of neurons talking to more other neurons. All right, so let's talk about how the neuron actually sends a message. So this does have more information than you need to know. Your book does a good job kind of describing it. I'm a really visual person, so I like to see it happening this way. So let's watch this and get a sense of what is happening. How does, oh wait, actually, looks like class is almost done. So we'll watch this video first thing next time. And with that being said, since it is so close to the end of class, I think I will go and change the due date for Smart Book Chapter 3 to Thursday. Hopefully you've all read the chapter already, so that everything I'm talking about today you've already covered once in the chapter, but I will move the Smart Book back to this day, but I'll keep Smart Book Chapter 4 the same. A lot of these first couple chapters I do tend to stick on a little longer than we really have time for, just because they're basic information that we really need to keep going forward. All right, so thank you for being in class today. I hope you've enjoyed learning about neurons. We'll see how they send their messages next time. And just know that's happening in your brain all the time. You're developing those new connections. So it's pretty neat to think about. All right, have a good day.